The conflict is still ongoing. Drones have been flying around both on the battlefield and the battlefield zone, but also into Ukraine and Russia from both sides. Zelensky announced that a Russian drone had hit reactor number 4 in Chernobyl, a nuclear reactor that went bang in 1986. And that's been covered by a big dome, but that dome seems to have been damaged and they're worried about radiation. So that's the battlefield at the moment. The Russians are making very slow progress in and around Donetsk and the Donbass, and trying to take back Ukrainian controlled areas of Kursk, and still making very slow progress regarding that. The Ukrainians aren't advancing. It's very much a defensive operation. There was a small offensive in Kursk, but overall, the Ukrainians are holding the line and doing very well. Now, in terms of the ceasefire, Donald Trump, as we're going to experience over the next 4 years, has been doing a lot of talking. And some of it has been slightly coherent and some of it hasn't been coherent. So Pete Hegseth announced that Ukraine was not going to join NATO anytime soon, that Donald Trump had had a phone call with Vladimir Putin and was then going to tell Vladimir Zelensky about his phone call with Vladimir Putin, which went against what Zelensky had asked for, that the Americans talk to the Ukrainians and the Europeans and then talk to the Russians once they've all come up with the three of them, the Americans, Ukrainians, and Europeans, have a coherent negotiating strategy. But that hasn't happened. Donald Trump also announced that the Munich conference was going to be the first time that Russians, Ukrainians, and US officials met. That doesn't seem to have happened. The JD Vance, the vice president, seems to have postponed his meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky. The Germans have said unequivocally that no Russian has accreditation and therefore will not be coming anywhere near Munich and Germany. What Donald Trump has said and what actually happens in reality are separate things. There may be a meeting next week in Saudi Arabia or the UAE. No one is quite certain. We'll have to wait and see what happens next week. But there is the very real possibility, at least from what Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesperson, has been talking about, that Donald Trump has been invited for the May 9th Victory Day parade in Moscow. And this will be where a potential ceasefire will be signed. We will have to wait and see as to what actually happens with negotiations. We know that Trump likes strong men. It's very much a bromance and has was at the beginning in terms of when Trump was president in 2016 to 2020, and that seems to have continued. It's, I think, enlightening that he spoke to President Putin first and keeps on talking about President Putin, but never says the same about Zelensky. It's always Zelensky. It's never President Zelensky. Donald Trump, like Vladimir Putin, I think, is a realist. The idea that great powers do what they want and small powers have to accept it. And Ukraine is, in their conception, a small power. It is very much the 19th century Treaty of Berlin process where big powers, Britain, France, Prussia, Russia, sat down and redrew the map of Europe. And that's very much, I think, the thinking, particularly of Putin, but also of Donald Trump. So the relationship is one of, I would put it as a bromance, quite simply. We don't know quite who's actually doing the negotiating for the Americans. Trump seems to be relying on his good friend Vitkov. At the same time, there was Keith Kellogg, who seems to have been sidelined, but also is in Munich. So no one is quite certain who is actually the main negotiator and what they're doing. Trump, I think, is trying to talk to both sides. Hopefully, he's still talking to the Ukrainians. I think that Zelensky is being quite clear that we will not accept any deal between America and Russia. Kaya Kallas, the head of diplomacy for the EU, has said we will not accept any deal that does not at least include us and does not include Ukraine. Europe, and when I say Europe, I include Britain in this, will find it very difficult without America. They have spent, I mean, the invasion of Ukraine has been going on since 2014. Europe has spent a decade navel gazing at without preparing for the military aspects, and it is a question. increasingly it's a question of not if, it's when, as to when Vladimir Putin decides that Russian forces will move across the Dnipro or they will test the waters in Estonia, for instance. So yes, it is going to be very difficult, but increasingly we can see that Europe is going to be left to defend Ukraine and possibly to foot the bill for Ukraine's economic reconstruction. We're waiting on JD Vance, whether he's going to make the announcement that 20,000 American soldiers are pulling out of Europe. That's something that we're all waiting for because that seems to be the rumor that's going around at the moment that the Americans are going to pull most of their troops out of. I mean, he said they would deploy US troops if Putin decides not to negotiate. Putin will continue to negotiate because it's in his interest to negotiate. He believes that he's winning this war. He can spin it out for as long as possible. The Russian economy relies increasingly on maintaining a war footing. So, and he needs time to rebuild his military, which Russia is doing at the moment, as well as fighting in Ukraine. And it's become relatively effective at doing that. So he will quite happily spin negotiations out for many years. We saw this with Minsk. We've seen this throughout Putin's presidency, starting with Moldova in 1999, when acting president, he showed quite what he means by negotiations, which is to spin them out and keep the West weak. So it all depends on when the Americans get bored, by which point Ukraine may not exist as we know it today by that point. At the moment, it does look particularly dark in regards to Ukraine. We simply don't know. Perhaps Donald Trump is going to pull it out of the fire. And this is a negotiating stance that only he can see or his team can see. It is bizarre to start by saying that NATO, Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO. It is bizarre to also say that having wanted European peacekeepers, they're not going to have any American support, which means that no European leader in their right mind is going to send their troops into Ukraine, knowing that they could be shot at without American backup. So it is a rather strange thing to be doing. And at the moment, I think the Kremlin is looking very happy about the situation. That may change again. Trump is mercurial. Trump has a short attention span. Vladimir Putin may, it's possible, unlikely, but possible, may overplay his hand. He may decide, Trump may also just get bored and realize that he's been had by Putin. It also depends on who was the last person to talk to him. So there are so many possibilities as to what may be happening. But at the moment, as of today, it is quite dark for Ukraine.